I had always loved December for the quiet way it seemed to slow the world down, the way the cold pressed people indoors and the snow, when it came, muffled the usual sounds of the neighborhood. That year, my family decided to go all out with the Christmas decorations, which had become something of a ritual for us. We had a modest two-story house on a quiet street, and every year we tried to top the previous one. The front yard would fill with icicle lights, colored bulbs, and a scattering of inflatable decorations, while the roofline got outlined with pure white lights. It was always cheerful, familiar, and I found it comforting, the way the glow from our house pooled onto the snow-covered street in the evenings. It started one evening while my parents were on ladders adjusting the lights along the roof. I was inside, helping untangle a string of colored bulbs near the front window. The winter sky was already dark, the pale moon reflecting off the crusted snow, and I noticed, almost by accident, that one section of our icicle lights along the porch had an odd rhythm. It wasn't a simple flicker or a burned-out bulb. It seemed deliberate, like a pause followed by a few rapid flashes. I blinked a few times, certain my eyes were playing tricks, but the pattern repeated itself over and over. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the strand was faulty, the wiring loose, nothing more than that. But there was a precision to the timing that didn't feel random. The next night, I watched the lights more closely, standing on the porch in the bitter cold while my parents fussed with the driveway decorations. I started noticing sequences, short bursts that seemed to break down into small clusters. My first thought was that it was Morse code. I had learned the basics once in high school, mostly out of curiosity, but I couldn't remember the exact patterns. Still, I jotted down the flashes in a notebook, using dots and dashes in the way I remembered. At the time, it felt obsessive, almost ridiculous, but the rhythm was too regular to ignore. There was something deliberate there, and it was unnerving because I couldn't figure out why the lights would be doing this on their own. Over the following nights, the pattern became more complex, and the timing more deliberate. I began to correlate what I was seeing with events around the neighborhood. It started subtly, almost in passing. There was a story in the paper about a neighbor's dog running loose and causing a car accident. I looked at my notes from the previous night and realized the sequence of lights had matched the letters of the dog's name if interpreted in Morse. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but then almost immediately afterward, a local man went missing while walking home from the store. The lights had spelled out his initials the night before. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it was random, that I was overlaying meaning onto patterns my mind wanted to see. But the unease settled into my chest like ice. It wasn't imagination. The lights weren't broken. They weren't random. I stopped trying to sleep in the living room that week, sitting instead by the front window with a blanket around my shoulders, notebook in hand, eyes tracing each flicker. I started documenting every event I could find in local news reports, small things at first, accidents, minor injuries, cars hitting mailboxes. But then the pattern escalated. One night, a family 2 houses down had a fire, a result of a forgotten candle left burning. The lights had spelled something like caution, which I recognized only after matching the flashes to letters painstakingly. My hands shook while I traced the sequence, a physical reaction that was impossible to rationalize. The lights were communicating, and it was terrifying because it felt informed, precise, like someone, or something, was monitoring the neighborhood with alarming attention. The days grew colder, and the darkness came earlier. The streets were emptying out as people stayed indoors, lights glowing in windows like distant stars. I started noticing small details that made the situation worse. The flashes sometimes changed when I stepped back from the window, as if aware I was watching. I couldn't explain it, couldn't find any source in the wiring, any technical explanation. Every night I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the patterns were a coincidence, but the longer I observed, the more impossible that explanation became. When a local man fell down a staircase, breaking his arm, the lights had spelled warning the night before. The connection was undeniable, and the fear settled in permanently. I couldn't walk past the front porch without feeling a knot in my stomach, a sense that every flicker was monitoring me, anticipating me, aware of me. By the end of the second week, I was no longer alone in my observations. My parents started to notice the strange flickering too, though they were reluctant to acknowledge it at first. They had begun to associate it with bad luck or faulty wiring, but I could see it in their faces, the same flicker of recognition, the dawning unease that made their usual cheer fade. We spent hours trying to examine the strand of lights, tracing it from plug to bulb, checking for shorts or loose connections. Nothing explained the sequence. Nothing accounted for the terrifying precision with which it seemed to match neighborhood events. It had started small, almost benign, but now the implications were clear. Someone or something was communicating through our house in a way that directly related to the real world, and we had no control over it. By the third week of December, I was barely sleeping, barely eating, spending hours staring at the lights, notebook open, fingers marking sequences, trying to anticipate what might happen next. The messages were growing longer, more urgent. They weren't just spelling names or initials anymore. They were spelling phrases like danger near or stay inside. Every time a new incident occurred, a car collision at the intersection, a missing child found wandering near the park, I traced back the previous night's lights and confirmed, every time, that the sequence had predicted it. The dread became physical, a constant ache that never left. I realized that it wasn't random chance, and there was no natural explanation that made sense. The only solution was to act, to try to prevent what was coming. The day before Christmas Eve, I unplugged the strand of lights entirely. I thought it might stop whatever was happening, give us a chance to regain normalcy. For the first time in weeks, there was silence on the porch, an absence that felt strangely oppressive. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. My mind ran through every possibility, every pattern, the sequences I had documented. I realized then that unplugging the lights had not erased the knowledge I now carried. I had seen too much, understood too much, and there was no returning to ignorance. The neighborhood would continue to unfold, accidents would continue, but I had the ability to anticipate them, to intervene if necessary. It was a burden I hadn't asked for, and one I could never relinquish. By the time Christmas morning arrived, I had made a routine. I watched, I documented, I prepared quietly to act when the lights indicated danger. It was exhausting and isolating, but somehow necessary. My parents, still uneasy, had begun to leave me to it, their own festive cheer muted by the undercurrent of unease. For me, the lights had become a lens through which the world was filtered, a way to perceive the hidden rhythm of the neighborhood, the quiet signals that preceded disaster. There was no supernatural force, no malevolent being. It was entirely mechanical, electrical, and yet uncannily intelligent. Perhaps it was someone's work, a sophisticated system of monitoring, or a freak coincidence amplified by my own attention. Whatever it was, I had learned to read it, to respect it, and to live within its pattern. The December snow fell silently outside, the rest of the neighborhood blissfully unaware, while I kept watch, pen in hand, ready for the next flicker that would guide me. I started my shift just after 6 in the evening on a cold December night, when the air outside carried that brittle, gray quality that seemed to suck the warmth from your skin as soon as you stepped out of the car. The mall had been closed to the public for months, but management still kept a skeleton crew of security guards on the overnight rotation. It was just me and 2 others that night, assigned to patrol the empty halls, make sure the alarms weren't tripped, and check that none of the few remaining staff on site were causing trouble. The holiday season made the mall feel almost alive even when it was deserted. Storefronts were decked in fake snow and string lights, mannequins wore Santa hats and ugly sweaters, and plastic wreaths hung over doors that hadn't opened in years. It was all carefully staged for what would normally be a festive December, but the quiet was absolute once the last shoppers left, and the emptiness pressed indifferently at night. I started my rounds on the upper level, flashlight in hand, checking the sliding doors and the large department stores that had long since been abandoned. The air inside was warmer than outside, but it carried the faint, sour smell of old cleaning chemicals mixed with the tang of heated plastic and carpet. The echo of each footstep was unusually sharp, bouncing off the walls in a way that made every corner feel watched, even though we were alone. I got to the atrium, where a giant fake Christmas tree sat, needles dusted in glitter that sparkled under the fluorescent lights. The ornaments seemed bright and cheerful, but in the silence, they felt eerie. I kept moving, listening for anything out of place. It started with the sound of children laughing. At first, I assumed it was coming from outside, from the street, or maybe from a radio playing in one of the empty storefronts. The laughter was soft, high-pitched, and very deliberate, echoing along the corridors. It didn't make sense. The mall had been empty for months, and no children were allowed inside after hours. I paused, listening, and the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more complete. I told myself it was a recording someone had left on, a leftover promotional tape, but then the sound started again, closer this time, bouncing off the walls in patterns that didn't match any normal layout of the building. I moved toward the food court, the place that had the most stores still technically in operation, even if nobody shopped there anymore. As I walked, the fluorescent lights flickered slightly, a weak strobe effect that made the plastic decorations shimmer and the reflections in the glass storefronts distort. Then came the music. Low at first, barely audible, the tinny sound of a Christmas carol filtered through the speakers in the ceiling. It was slowed down, warped, stretched, like someone had manipulated it to sound unnatural. It was the only sound in the empty space, but it carried a weight that made my stomach tighten. I shone my flashlight across the tables and chairs of the food court. Everything was in its place, untouched, as it should be. But then I noticed something odd. The mannequins in the clothing store across the way had shifted. One of them faced the glass now, arms extended slightly forward, a posture it had never held before. Another leaned unnaturally, as if frozen mid-step. I checked the security cameras from the small office near the main entrance. Everything looked normal at first, empty halls, the lights still flickering. Then I noticed the shelves in one of the smaller stores, the ones that usually sold toys, had been raided. Boxes were opened, packages torn, and some items strewn across the floor. No alarm had gone off, nothing had been tripped, and there was no sign of forced entry. I went down the hall to inspect. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, which made no sense for the empty store. The mannequins seemed almost deliberate in the way they were positioned, some facing the doors as if they were watching anyone who entered. Over the next hour, the sounds became more frequent and intense. The laughter came in bursts, high and desperate, echoing from corners I had already checked. The carols played in distorted loops, the words stretched and warped until they sounded more like faint screams than music. The intercom buzzed intermittently, delivering messages in a tinny voice that should have been cheerful but was not. "Merry Christmas," it said at first, normal enough, but each repetition grew warped, elongated, and distorted, so that the words became hollow, frantic. I moved cautiously down one corridor, my flashlight illuminating empty halls lined with closed stores. Every so often, a mannequin had moved just slightly, rotated, or turned to face me from the shadows. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that the low light and stress were warping my perception. But the feeling of being watched never went away. One of my co-workers, Daniels, went to check the upper-level corridors while I stayed on the ground floor. The mall felt like a maze at night, and the sound of his footsteps eventually faded into silence. I moved toward the center atrium, flashlight sweeping every corner, when I noticed that one of the stores, usually locked and bare, had its door slightly ajar. Inside, the shelves were completely empty, the packaging ripped and shredded, as if someone had scavenged it. My skin crawled. There was no way anyone could have gotten in without triggering alarms. The mall's security system was top of the line. I walked closer, shining the beam around the interior, and then I heard it, a distinct, slow tap behind me. I spun, flashlight darting across the empty corridor. Nothing. The echo of the tap followed me down the hall, growing louder for a moment, then fading again. It was impossible, but I could feel the tension in the air thickening, a pressure that made my chest tight. I tried calling Daniels on the radio. Nothing. I called again louder, but only static came back. That was when I noticed the intercom crackle and spurt out a long, distorted sequence of sounds that resembled a frantic mixture of carols and shrieks. My heart was hammering. I knew Daniels had gone to a different part of the mall, but the radio had no signal from him. I moved cautiously toward the upper level, climbing the stairwell slowly. The halls were empty, lights flickering, and the mannequins along the corridors now seemed deliberately placed to block or obscure certain angles. Then I reached the top floor and stopped. Daniels wasn't there. None of the corridors showed any sign of him. The lights above flickered violently, and I felt a chill run through me. The sound of laughter and music was coming from all directions now, distorted and overlapping, echoing around corners I couldn't see. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand. I checked every exit, every room, every small utility closet. Daniels was gone. There was no sign of struggle, nothing out of place except for the increasingly impossible positions of mannequins and the raided shelves. I retraced our steps, every corridor, every security office, back down to the main floor. The laughter and music stopped when I stood still, then returned the instant I started moving. The feeling of the mall itself shifting around me was overwhelming, the halls longer, the corners sharper, the air colder. I realized, finally, that Daniels must have wandered into one of the storage rooms or in used hallways and gotten trapped or lost. The mall was a labyrinth at night, more complicated than the maps or cameras could ever show. By dawn, the first maintenance crew arrived, and the mall returned to the familiar, empty state it had during the day. The lights were normal, the shelves in the stores still rated, but nothing moved anymore. The intercom played regular, cheerful music again. Daniels never came back. After a week of investigation, it became clear that he had gone into a locked service area that had a faulty door mechanism. When the security team tried to follow, the hallways and storage rooms made it impossible to find him, and eventually, it was concluded he had collapsed or gotten stuck somewhere inside the building overnight, alone. There were no supernatural forces at work, just an empty mall with confusing layouts, faulty doors, distorted sound systems, and the stress of working alone at night. The laughter and music had been echoes, feedback, and quirks of the intercom and speakers, amplified by our exhaustion and fear. The mannequins and rated shelves had been the result of prior trespassing and careless handling, misinterpreted in the darkness. It was a terrifying night, but entirely explainable once daylight and rational investigation returned. The mall remained open during the day, festive as ever, while the memory of that night haunted those of us who had worked the graveyard shift in the December dark. I was driving a long, empty stretch of highway in early December, the kind of road that seems to stretch endlessly through frozen fields and forests stripped bare by the season. A snowstorm had begun earlier in the afternoon, heavy flakes drifting down in thick sheets that made the streetlights shimmer in the gray dusk. The wipers of my old sedan fought constantly to clear the windshield, smearing slush across the glass, and I kept my speed low, trying to judge where the road ended and the roadside began. The air smelled sharply of frost and wet asphalt, and my hands, gripping the steering wheel, were stiff inside my thin gloves. Every so often, a gust of wind would sweep across the highway, rattling the car and coating it in a thin layer of fresh snow. It was the kind of isolation that makes every sound feel louder, every shadow feel heavier. The radio had long since gone static, and the landscape outside the fogged windows was a blur of white and dark silhouettes of leafless trees. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, scanning for other cars, houses, or signs of life. The highway had been quiet for miles, nothing but the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on snow and ice. I noticed her first as a shadow on the side of the road, a small figure bundled up against the cold. She was walking along the shoulder, hunched over, with her coat pulled tight and a scarf wrapped around her face. I slowed and pulled over a few feet ahead, hoping to offer her a ride. She hesitated for a moment, her head ducked, and then climbed into the passenger seat without a word. I glanced over at her. Her eyes were wide, almost glazed, and her hands trembled inside her mittens. She didn't speak. I asked her where she was headed, and she simply nodded toward the next town down the highway. That was enough for me, so I started driving again, carefully maintaining traction on the slick surface. The silence in the car was almost complete. The snowstorm outside muted everything. I tried to focus on the road, but I kept glancing at her, uneasy at the way she stared out the window, not moving, not reacting to anything. After a few minutes, I realized I hadn't heard her breathing. When I looked back, the seat was empty. The door was still locked, the passenger side untouched, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. My heart rate picked up, and I pulled over to check the mirrors in the back seat, but there was no sign of her. The only movement was the snow blowing across the asphalt. I drove on cautiously, feeling the weight of the empty highway in every turn. The wind howled through the bare trees, and the storm made everything beyond a few dozen feet vanish into white. Then, as I crested a small rise in the road, I saw her again. She was sitting on the edge of the highway shoulder, knees pulled to her chest, staring straight ahead. I stopped the car, unsure if I wanted to get out or keep driving. She looked at me as I approached, the same wide, vacant eyes, the same bundled-up figure trembling against the cold. I offered her the passenger seat again. She slid in silently. The air inside the car was warm compared to the biting cold outside, and I watched her shiver even with the heater on full blast. When I asked her if she was okay, she whispered something I barely caught. "Don't stay here for Christmas." Her voice was soft, hesitant, but firm. That was all she said. I kept my focus on the road, glancing at her in the corner of my eye, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I reached the next town and stopped at the first gas station I could find. The lot was mostly empty, and the fluorescent lights reflected off the snow in harsh, cold rectangles. I asked around about her, describing the girl as best I could, but no one had seen her before. No one recognized her, and no one mentioned anyone missing. The store clerk raised an eyebrow, but went back to stocking shelves without comment. I returned to the car, and she was gone again, as if she had evaporated into the storm. I drove on, the strange sense of déjà vu pressing down on me, a gnawing uncertainty that I couldn't shake. The highway curved and climbed, winding through a narrow valley lined with dark evergreens. The snow was falling heavier now, and visibility was nearly zero. I kept my headlights low, trying to avoid the glare, feeling the road beneath the tires give way slightly under the weight of fresh snow. And then, as if on cue, there she was, sitting again by the roadside, knees drawn up, staring at the white expanse ahead. I pulled over cautiously. She got in without a word. The heater blew warm air across the windshield, fogging it, but I could still see the snow swirling around the car in little whirlwinds. Every instinct told me something was wrong, but I didn't know what to do. There was no way she could have kept up with the road on foot so quickly. The air in the car was tense, brittle. When I looked at her, I noticed the tips of her fingers red and raw from the cold, her cheeks flushed, lips chapped. Her presence made the interior of the car feel simultaneously heavy and fragile, like it was about to shatter. I asked her again if she needed help, if she was lost or injured. She repeated the same words. "Don't stay here for Christmas." The whisper was almost inaudible over the storm, but I caught it clearly. It sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I reached the end of the highway eventually, where the road merged into a small cluster of houses, all dark except for a few dim porch lights. I stopped and looked around. No one approached. No one asked questions. When I stepped out to see if she was still there, she was gone again. I drove through the town, checking each street, and nobody had seen her. I spoke to a few people at a small diner, trying to describe her, but all eyes widened in confusion, and no one recalled seeing anyone like her at all. It felt like the town had been empty for days. The diner's heater rattled against the walls, and the smell of coffee and frying oil was heavy in the small space, yet her absence left a hollow ache in my chest. By then, I realized what had been happening. The roads, the towns, the snowstorms, they were all isolating me, narrowing my world to this strange, recurring figure. She had been appearing at points where I would have been most alone, guiding me to keep moving, repeating the same warning. It wasn't supernatural, just human in its own strange way, a deliberate, unnerving insistence. I could imagine her walking those roads in the storm, hiding, moving quietly unseen, while I drove past and missed her until the pattern repeated. The message she brought was clear, the urgency in her voice unmistakable. She wasn't there to scare me, she was trying to make me leave, to push me away from staying in a place where the weather, the emptiness, and the roads themselves might trap me, isolate me, or worse. It was the simplest, most human kind of warning, yet terrifying because of how easily I could have ignored it. I followed the highway out of the town, letting it take me back to the main road that would eventually lead to the interstate. Snow continued to fall, but I kept my speed cautious, aware now of how easy it would be to slide off the slick surface or get lost in the white blur. I didn't see her again, but I felt her presence in every stretch of road, in every drift of snow. I reached my car's exit onto the interstate, and as I merged, the storm seemed to lift slightly, the snow thinning enough for me to see the highway clearly. I checked the rearview mirror one last time. The roadside was empty, the town's quiet, the dark trees standing like silent sentinels along the edges of the snow. By the time I reached a more populated area, I could feel the tension in my shoulders ease. The roads were cleared, houses lit, and other cars moved past me in steady streams. I realized I hadn't thought about her presence in terms of fear anymore. It was a warning, a practical one disguised as something impossible. She had been trying to make sure I didn't get trapped, stranded, or isolated in the storm on a night that could have easily turned dangerous. When I finally reached my destination, safe, warm, and surrounded by signs of life, the snowstorm retreating behind me, I understood exactly what she had meant. I didn't stay for Christmas in that empty stretch of highway, in that snowstorm, in those silent towns. I left, and I survived, carrying the memory of her warning like a message I could never forget. The roads were clear again, the towns alive, the world normal, but I never drove that highway in December without thinking of her, and without remembering the urgency in her quiet, tremulous voice. Don't stay here for Christmas. I left the highway just after sunset, turning onto the narrow two-lane road that led through a small town I had passed many times but never really noticed. The sky was a dull, bruised gray, heavy with the kind of low winter clouds that seemed to push the light down and flatten the world. My car headlights cut a pale path through the darkness, illuminating frost-coated fields on either side, the edges of them marked by weathered fences and skeletal trees whose branches scraped the wind in a dry, rattling rhythm. The air was still, almost too still, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. The warmth from the heater pressed against my face, but it did little to shake the creeping unease that started in my chest. As I rolled into town, the first thing that struck me was the absence of light. I had expected the soft glow of porch lamps or the occasional neon sign from a corner store, but there was nothing. Every house along the main road was dark, windows reflecting only the faint glare of my headlights. Some houses looked abandoned, shutters hanging crookedly, lawns unkempt with winter debris, but others seemed maintained, neat in their silence. Cars were parked in driveways or along the street, untouched, frozen midlife like statues. The metal glinted under the headlights, but no smoke curled from exhaust pipes, no flicker of movement behind the glass. It was the first hint that something about this place wasn't ordinary. I eased the car along the main street. The pavement was slick, not with rain, but with a thin sheen of frost that caught in the headlights and made the yellow lines shimmer. The street lamps overhead flickered intermittently, casting quick, uneven shadows across the road. Each time a lamp went out, it left a pool of darkness that seemed to swallow the details of the street behind it, and I caught myself glancing instinctively over my shoulder, as if expecting the shadows to reach inside the car. The air grew sharper with every turn, a biting cold that seeped through the heater's warmth, nipping at my fingers even as I gripped the wheel. The chill carried a dryness, a metallic edge that made the back of my throat tingle. It was unnatural, the way the air felt static, heavy, as if the town had been sealed off from the rest of the world. I tried to reassure myself that I was simply driving through a quiet town in the off-season, maybe a place people passed through on their way somewhere else. But the silence was wrong. No dogs barked, no hum of electricity from open businesses, no distant laughter or the low hum of people in houses. My honks went unanswered, my calls to an empty street met only by the echo from the cold air. The only sound was the tires on the slick asphalt, steady and hollow, and the occasional creak of a loose sign swaying in the wind. It was the kind of silence that weighs on you, makes the hairs on your arms stand on end, and presses in from every direction. At the intersection ahead, the traffic light hung red, swinging slightly on its mount. I braked and stopped, glancing left and right. The cross streets were equally empty. No headlights, no moving shadows, nothing that suggested life. Then I saw movement at the edge of the light, faint at first, a ripple of darkness along the sidewalk. Shadows, human-shaped but indistinct, moving too slowly, too deliberately like they were stepping through molasses. They passed behind cars, sometimes disappearing entirely into the side streets. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. The longer I stared, the colder the air seemed to become, the frost along the edges of the windshield frosting over, as if the temperature inside the car itself were falling. My breath misted in short bursts, and I realized I had tensed, holding it without realizing. I tried to drive on, but the green light seemed reluctant to appear, lingering red as if the intersection itself were aware of my presence. The shadows moved again, now crossing streets and alleys, always just at the periphery of my headlights. They didn't approach the car, didn't make noise, but their motion was deliberate, purposeful, and it pulled at some primal part of my brain that told me to look away. I forced my gaze back to the road, gripping the steering wheel tighter, feeling the chill gnawing deeper, a physical pressure pressing against my chest. The heater rattled and coughed, weak against the cold that was no longer just outside but seeping in, like the town itself was exhaling around me. I started moving slowly, inching past the red light as if testing its limits. The shadows shifted with me, always a step ahead, never fully coming into view, never retreating entirely. I counted the houses as I passed, trying to impose some rational framework. 1, 2, 3, all dark. Storefronts with locked gates, peeling paint, letters in the windows that seemed older than they should, snow beginning to cling to the corners of the buildings where the wind had driven it in. No footprints in the thin frost along the sidewalks. Nothing to suggest anyone had been outside for hours, maybe days. The thought struck me suddenly that it wasn't just late or quiet. It was as if the town had frozen mid-activity, emptied without reason. A church appeared ahead, its tall steeple silhouetted against the gray sky. The doors were locked, of course, but the stained glass caught the weak ambient light in a way that made it look alive, like a painting in motion. I slowed, staring at the patterns, counting the shadows in the trees nearby, half expecting someone to step out and reveal that the entire scene was normal. Nothing happened. I realized my pulse was loud in my ears, my knuckles white against the wheel. My foot rested lightly on the brake, but the car was almost instinctively moving forward, drawn by some mixture of fear and the necessity of leaving. I finally reached the far edge of town, where the street opened to a bend in the road lined with trees. The lights had grown even more inconsistent, flickering and dying, leaving my headlights to carve narrow tunnels through the darkness. The shadows were gone, replaced by the stark silence of winter fields stretching to the horizon. I exhaled in a shuddering breath, aware of how rigid I had been, the ache in my neck from staring so long. The air was still cold, but no longer pressing in, no longer heavy with that strange, anticipatory tension. The town had receded behind me, and in its place was the clean, indifferent night, punctuated only by distant, ordinary sounds. The low hum of wind, the occasional caw of a crow. I glanced at the rearview mirror and noticed the faint outline of the town's first streetlights fading behind me. The darkness there seemed ordinary now, nothing sinister, just empty streets waiting for people to return. I realized I had driven past it almost without noticing, caught in a bubble of alertness and dread that had no reason beyond my own perception. My heartbeat slowed as the distance grew, and the rational part of my mind reasserted itself. Maybe the town was abandoned for the winter, maybe the streets were simply empty at dusk. Maybe the cold had played tricks, and shadows in peripheral vision had been nothing more than trees or signs, shifting with the wind. By the time I reached the next intersection and rejoined the main highway, the sense of unreality had ebbed completely. The headlights of other cars appeared, muffled sounds of tires on salted roads, the glow of distant houses. The town behind me seemed like a dream that had dissolved in the act of leaving. I rolled the windows down slightly, letting in the crisp, biting night air, feeling it wash through the car and flush the lingering tension from my chest. The highway stretched straight and open before me, the orange glow of distant street lamps marking the way to family, to warmth, to normalcy. I kept my eyes on the road, but I knew I would carry the memory of that town with me. The quiet streets, the dark houses, the weight of air that seemed alive, long after I had left its borders behind. I drove for hours along roads that had long since stopped feeling like thoroughfares and had started feeling like paths into emptiness. The December sky was low and gray, and snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the edges of the highway and coating the thin, scrubby trees that lined the shoulders. I had been hoping to reach a town before nightfall, but as the light dwindled and the thermometer in the car dipped steadily toward zero, I realized I was going to have to find somewhere to stay along this stretch of road that seemed to exist only for long, lonely drives. Then I saw it, a small motel set back off the highway, half hidden behind a row of evergreens. Its paint was flaking, and one of the neon signs above the entrance flickered weakly, but a faint glow came from the lobby window, which was enough for me to pull in. The lot was nearly empty except for a single car parked near the far edge. I parked near the office, feeling the crunch of hard snow beneath my boots as I approached. The lobby was silent, lit by a single overhead bulb that hummed faintly. There was a counter with a bell, a couple of chairs pushed neatly against the walls, and a small Christmas tree in the corner, decorated sparsely with a few plastic ornaments and a strand of lights that blinked irregularly. There was no one behind the counter, and no one came out when I lingered. It felt strange, but not immediately alarming. Some motels in remote areas are just sparsely staffed during holidays. A clipboard on the counter suggested that maybe I was supposed to leave my information there. I wrote my name, pulled my credit card from my wallet, and placed it on the counter. After a few minutes, the faint sound of shuffling came from a back room, and a man in a thin jacket appeared. He barely glanced at me, handed me a key, and muttered an instruction about room numbers before retreating again. The entire exchange was perfunctory, mechanical, and left me feeling slightly off balance, but I didn't dwell on it. I just wanted to get inside, warm up, and try to sleep. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and a faint smell of cleaning products mixed with the stale air of long-closed spaces. I set my luggage on the bed, turned on the heater, and unpacked a few essentials. The single window looked out over the parking lot and the row of darkened trees beyond. Outside, the snow had begun to stick more heavily, muffling the world in an unnatural quiet that seemed too still, almost deliberate. I pulled the covers over myself and tried to ignore the faint unease that had been following me since I entered the lobby. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind wandered, picking over details, the flickering lights, the absence of other guests, the way the man had seemed to disappear back into the building without explanation. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a shallow sleep, dreaming of endless white roads and forests I had never traveled. When I woke, the room was different. At first, I thought it was just the change in light, but then I noticed the toys. They were arranged meticulously on the floor in front of the bed, facing me in a manner that felt deliberate, almost calculated. Small plastic figures, a wooden train, a couple of stuffed animals. I didn't own these items, and they hadn't been there when I went to sleep. My heart started to race as I scanned the room. The lights along the baseboard that I hadn't noticed before blinked in patterns that were impossible to interpret. Some flickered rapidly, others glowed steadily, and together they created a rhythm that felt wrong, disjointed. I told myself it had to be a prank or some kind of strange marketing gimmick. I left the room immediately, checking the hall and lobby, but still, no one was in sight. The front desk remained empty, the corridor was silent, and the snow outside had turned the world into a quiet void. I returned to my room cautiously, trying to rationalize the situation. Perhaps the previous guests had left these items behind, or maybe the staff used this room as storage and had not cleaned properly. Yet that didn't explain the arrangement, the precision, the attention to how the toys faced me, the almost intentional feeling that they were observing. I searched the room, checking the closet, drawers, and even under the bed. Nothing else seemed disturbed. Exhaustion, combined with the cold creeping through the thin window, pushed me to try sleeping again, despite the creeping anxiety that clung to me. I woke several hours later to find more changes. My luggage, which I had left untouched, had been moved to the far side of the room. My coat, which I had draped over the chair, was folded neatly on top of it. Items from my suitcase, socks, toiletries, my watch, were rearranged in ways that made no practical sense but seemed purposeful. The most alarming discovery was on the window. Frost had formed in letters that spelled out a message: "Leave before it's too late." My first reaction was disbelief. I had lived in cold regions before, and I knew frost could form patterns, but letters, words, sentences? It was unnerving, and my pulse thumped in my ears as I approached to touch it. The glass was cold, but there was no obvious way someone could have written this from the outside without leaving footprints in the fresh snow. My mind raced for explanations. A prank, someone observing me through the window, some leftover decoration from a previous guest. But none of them fit perfectly. None explained the precision and intent that felt behind every detail in the room. I spent the rest of the night and early morning in a restless, near-constant state of vigilance. Every noise, the soft hum of the heater, the occasional shift of the building settling, the wind brushing against the trees, felt amplified. My imagination ran wild with every possible scenario, each more improbable than the last, but the unease never lessened. By dawn, the snow had stopped, and the pale winter sun cast long, weak light across the parking lot. I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, checking everything twice, ensuring I had all of my belongings. As I stepped out into the cold air, I scanned the building, expecting to see movement, someone watching, or some clue to explain what had happened, but the motel remained completely still. The lone car was gone, the neon sign still flickered weakly, and the building seemed almost as empty as when I arrived. The drive away was tense but uneventful. I didn't stop until I reached a town large enough to feel normal, where lights from stores, holiday decorations, and the distant hum of traffic reminded me that I was back in an inhabited world. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, but nothing appeared. When I finally stopped at a gas station and collected my thoughts, I realized that the motel, the toys, the lights, and the messages had been a strange, isolated incident. Perhaps it had been a staff member playing an extreme prank, perhaps a miscommunication or misunderstanding, but I could not identify a human source with certainty. All I knew was that the precision, the quiet observation, and the sense of deliberate intention had been real, and it had been enough to shake me deeply. Weeks later, I researched the motel and discovered it had a long history of strange occurrences reported by travelers. Misplaced items, odd decorations appearing overnight, and unnerving messages left for guests. No one had ever been harmed, and no legal action had ever been taken. It seemed the incidents were tolerated as long as guests checked out safely, leaving no trace of confrontation. Understanding that did little to calm the lingering sense of violation I felt. I never returned to that area, and I never stayed at another remote motel alone during the holidays. Even now, when I close my eyes in winter, I can picture those toys lined up in the dimly lit room, facing me, the strange rhythm of lights flickering, and the frost on the window insisting I leave before it was too late. It was a reminder that sometimes isolation, attention, and deliberate manipulation can terrify far more than any tangible threat, and that some encounters are designed to be unsettling simply because they are intentional, precise, and inescapable. December arrived with a weight that seemed heavier than usual that year. The mountain roads were already slick with early snow, and the wind carried a sharpness that cut through the layers of clothing I had piled on in preparation for the trip. We were a small group of travelers, strangers brought together by a last-minute arrangement to rent a remote cabin far from the nearest town. None of us knew the mountains well, but the promise of quiet, isolation, and the stark beauty of snow-covered peaks had been too tempting to resist. The roads were narrow, twisting through dense pine forests, the kind where the trees grow so close together that the sky seems pinched, and the fading sunlight barely reaches the snow-laden ground. By the time we reached the cabin, dusk had fallen, and the storm that had been hinted at in the forecast was moving fast, turning the wind into a low, continuous howl. The cabin itself was older, made of thick, dark timber with small windows that looked out into the surrounding forest. Smoke was already curling lazily from the stone chimney, a sign that the previous tenants had left it in working condition, and the interior smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine sap. There was a single main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft with a few beds. The power lines were visible only from the front of the property, strung haphazardly and clearly susceptible to the mounting storm. We unpacked quickly, aware of the fading light, and started a fire, the kind that hissed and sputtered before finding its rhythm, casting dancing shadows across the room. The first hours passed in a mix of settling in and uneasy attention to the storm outside. The wind rattled the shutters and pressed against the walls in a way that made the entire cabin seem like it was leaning into the snow. Snowflakes, large and heavy, began to accumulate against the windows, pressed into patterns by gusts that made the glass tremble. By nightfall, the storm had intensified. The roads were now completely white, and any thought of leaving had disappeared along with the fading day. The cabin felt like a small, fragile bubble in the vast, cold wilderness. At first, the noises were easy to ignore. The wind and snow made everything outside sound alive. Trees groaned under the weight of the ice, and the branches scratched against the roof. But later, I noticed sounds that seemed almost deliberate, separate from the storm. The faint scrape of something moving across the snow near the perimeter. A soft tap that might have been a branch, but had a rhythm that didn't match the wind. I tried to convince myself it was the storm, that the mind was doing what it always does in isolation, exaggerating the small into the sinister. Still, the unease grew, each sound sharper than the last. By the second day, the power had gone out completely. The cabin was plunged into dim, gray light filtered through the snow-heavy windows. The phone lines were dead, no crackle, no dial tone. The snowstorm had turned the outside world into an unbroken wall of white. The cold seeped through the walls, cold that felt viscous, lingering in the corners of the room, and no matter how close I stayed to the fire, it seemed impossible to fully shake it. The others moved slowly, hunched against the chill, faces pale from both the cold and exhaustion. It became impossible to track time, the daylight diffused, the storm masking any sense of the hour. That night, the strange noises returned and intensified. Scratching, whispering sounds, soft taps, and the faint scrape of something heavy being dragged across snow that had no discernible tracks. I pressed my face to the window, expecting to see something, anyone, but the snow was untouched. The wind masked footprints and eroded any trail, leaving a pure, indifferent whiteness outside. Yet the noises came closer in waves, ebbing and flowing with a rhythm that made my chest tighten. The others began to move in jerky, tense ways, listening, peering through the dim light as if their eyes could penetrate the wall of white. There were moments of silence so complete it was like holding a breath that might burst the ears, followed by sudden scrapes and taps that set every nerve on edge. The cold compounded the fear. Bodies huddled near the fire, yet shivering persisted. Fingers and toes burned and tingled, and the warmth of the fire seemed fragile against the unrelenting chill that seeped through the floors and walls. Food ran low faster than expected, as eating required preparation and movement in the cold that felt exhausting. Mental strain built quietly, a slow grind. Sleep became fragmented, punctuated by flinches at noises outside. The mind began to create connections between sound and presence, though rational thought insisted otherwise. It was on the third night that one of us disappeared. I remember noticing the absence first, not in the frantic way that panic strikes, but as a small, heavy void in the room. Chairs remained pulled out, belongings left in small, ordinary disarray. At first, we assumed someone had gone to the bathroom or to check outside, even though the storm made that impossible. Calls and searching revealed nothing. The snow was unbroken, showing no footprints, no disturbance, nothing to suggest a path of exit. Panic slowly took hold, sharp and cold, carving out an instinct to flee even though escape was out of the question. We scoured every room, every closet, every inch of the loft, shouting, listening, but the cabin was stubbornly empty of them. The realization settled like ice in the chest. There was no rational explanation that fit the evidence we could see. The following hours were the longest I have ever endured. The storm continued, merciless, the wind lashing against the cabin, shaking shutters and doors. The fire dwindled to glowing embers that seemed to mock the cold, and every shadow became a suspicion. I moved methodically, checking the rooms, making sure doors were locked, that the others were accounted for, and listening to the noises that now seemed to pulse with awareness. There was nothing supernatural here, nothing unreal. Only snow, wind, ice, and the human imagination stretched thin by fear and isolation. Still, the brain will create patterns in randomness when pushed to its limits. The scratches might have been branches, the whispers the wind shifting against the cabin walls, the scraping sound just ice moving across itself. Yet nothing in reasoning could make the absence of the missing person feel less terrifying. By the fourth day, the storm began to ease, and the sun pierced the gray for the first time. The snow outside was deep, silent, and pristine, masking all previous movement. We had to make a decision. With careful measurement, we prepared to leave, knowing that staying longer would risk frostbite, malnutrition, and further psychological strain. The path down the mountain was difficult, visibility limited by drifted snow, and every step required careful placement to avoid hidden drifts and unstable footing. One by one we descended, hearts pounding, muscles tense, glancing constantly at the surrounding forest that seemed so quiet now, deceptively calm after days of chaos. The cabin remained behind us, dark and silent, with only the occasional plume of smoke rising from its chimney as a reminder of our brief, trapped existence. Eventually, we reached a maintained road, the first signs of civilization in days, and from there, we were able to contact authorities and report the disappearance. Search teams later combed the surrounding area, but no trace was found beyond the cabin. No footprints in the snow, no disturbed trees, nothing to suggest where the person had gone. It remained a stark reminder that even in a fully explainable world, human vulnerability is profound, and isolation, combined with weather, terrain, and the limits of perception, can create situations that feel almost impossible to survive. The cabin trip ended in exhaustion and lingering unease. The storm now a memory etched in muscle soreness, frostbitten fingers, and sleepless nights. The mountains were indifferent, and the snow did not care for our presence or absence. We left with the certainty that the missing person had not simply wandered off in a conscious way. The environment was harsh, unpredictable, and every misstep was unforgiving. It was a clear, brutal lesson about winter, isolation, and how quickly ordinary circumstances can escalate when nature is allowed to dominate and human control is removed. Nothing supernatural occurred, only snow, wind, ice, and the terrifyingly simple fact of being lost in a landscape that does not bend to human will. December had settled over the countryside with a quiet, suffocating weight. Snow lay thick along the shoulders of the narrow roads I traveled each morning, compressed by the occasional car or truck, and the ever-present gray sky pressed down on the fields in every direction. I had been delivering mail in this area for nearly 20 years, driving the same routes, passing the same wooden fences, farmhouses, and shuttered barns. Nothing about the route had ever unsettled me before, but that December felt different from the first moment I turned onto the snow-packed lane leading to the old post office on the edge of town. It was a Tuesday late morning, and the roads were nearly deserted. I parked my truck beside the post office, its tires crunching on the frozen gravel. The building smelled of paper, damp cardboard, and stale coffee. Inside, the usual hum of fluorescent lights felt unusually harsh against the soft, drifting cold outside. My supervisor, an older woman with a perpetually distracted expression, handed me a bundle of mail. Most of it was routine: bills, holiday cards, a few packages that would need to be signed for. But tucked at the bottom of the pile, wedged between envelopes for houses long abandoned, was a stack of letters tied together with a brittle piece of string. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly faded, and the postmarks ranged from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. They were addressed to me, or rather, to my home at the time I grew up, decades before I was born. I assumed they had been lost in transit or forgotten, but something about the neatness of the bundle made me hesitate. The first letter fell apart at the edges as I peeled open the envelope. The handwriting was precise, looping, and unnervingly familiar in tone. It described a day I hadn't yet experienced. My mother's car sliding on an icy patch outside the small grocery store, her arm bruised from the collision, the cashier rushing to help. The words were meticulous, almost obsessively detailed, down to the brand of milk she had dropped and the exact color of her scarf. I sat back in my chair, heart thumping, telling myself it was coincidence. Old letters misdelivered, vague memories that might someday line up with life's accidents. But then I opened the second. It described my brother's broken leg, a fall from the rickety ladder in our backyard shed. The date on the envelope was a full decade before the event it described. I tried to rationalize, thinking maybe it was someone's cruel joke, some elaborate hoax written with knowledge of my family's habits. Each letter after that grew more precise. They spoke of a winter storm that knocked out power for a week, of my father losing a wallet containing a critical check, and even a minor kitchen fire that left the living room wallpaper singed. Details that no stranger could have known unless they had been in the house, in the family, intimately aware of our lives decades before they occurred. I drove home with the letters stacked on the passenger seat, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The snow had started falling again, soft flakes brushing against the windshield as I passed the old grain silos and frost-covered cornfields. I had the irrational sensation that the world outside had gone quiet in a new way, as if the town itself had paused to observe me. By the time I reached my home, dusk had settled in fully, the faint light from the windows of nearby houses glinting off the snow. I placed the letters on the kitchen table, sorted them roughly by date, and began reading them in order. Each one described a precise event in my family's future. Not simply generalities or warnings, but exact outcomes, exact timings. It was like reading a diary written backward. As I absorbed the details, I realized I had no idea where this stack of letters had come from, and I felt a gnawing sense of inevitability. Each letter seemed to demand attention, and yet the stories it told were inescapable. The strangest part was that each one also hinted at something darker. It seemed to know the order in which misfortunes would strike, the sequence of injuries, illnesses, accidents. And gradually, with a growing sense of dread, I realized the sequence pointed toward me. Over the next days, I couldn't stop myself from following the letters. If a letter described my father slipping on the ice near the driveway, I would go out and make sure the patch was salted. If another described the stove catching fire, I checked the pilot lights, turned off the burners, tested the smoke alarms. The letters worked like instructions or warnings that I could act on to prevent tragedies, but only partially. Some events felt unavoidable, their minutiae too exact to change, and even when I intervened, the way reality bent in response left me shaken. A branch that was meant to fall and hit the car's windshield would somehow detour to the side. A kitchen knife destined to slip would land harmlessly on the counter. The letters weren't just describing events. They were steering them, shaping them, nudging reality like a careful hand guiding a toy across the floor. The cold December mornings blurred into evenings where the wind howled outside my windows. I began delivering the mail as usual, but I found myself constantly glancing at the letters in the truck. Every envelope was addressed to someone I loved. Every letter contained instructions I couldn't ignore. The town around me felt hollow, as if the snow had muffled the world's usual vibrancy. Each mailbox I approached seemed loaded with more than paper. It carried the weight of impending consequences. Every step I took felt synchronized with the precise timeline laid out in the letters. Then I opened the final envelope. It was dated for the following week. The handwriting was the same, the ink fresh, though the paper was yellowed as if time had been compressed around it. The letter described in exacting detail the moment I would die, not through accident or illness, but through a simple misstep in the driveway while delivering mail to a house I had passed hundreds of times. It outlined the fall, the bruise to the temple, the precise angle at which I would hit the ground. I froze, the letter trembling in my hands. I could see the driveway in my mind, the snow and ice where it would give way beneath me. I considered leaving the mail route entirely, quitting the postal service, driving far away, anything to break the sequence. But the more I resisted, the more the letters seemed to manifest. Every action I took to avoid the predicted events only delayed them briefly or diverted them slightly, until the inevitable outcome loomed closer. The letter's instructions were not suggestions, they were probabilities that solidified into reality. On the morning the letter predicted my death, I bundled myself against the cold and headed out. Each step felt measured, every breath loud in the frozen silence. I approached the final driveway described in the letter, sliding my weight carefully on the compacted snow. For a moment, I thought I had done it, avoided the end. Then a thin layer of black ice, invisible beneath the snow, shifted beneath my boots. My legs slipped, my arms flailed, and I hit the ground hard, just as the letter had described. Pain shot through my skull, vision narrowing. I lay there, snow pressed against my cheek, unable to move as the world slowed. Somehow I survived. A neighbor's dog barked, then the owner appeared, pulling me upright and helping me into the warmth of their house. I realized then that the letters did not compel death. They predicted it, yes, but they also offered a choice in how I responded. The final letter had been precise, but reality had enough flexibility for me to survive if I acted, even without fully understanding why. I never opened the letters again. I returned them to the post office, explained they were misdelivered decades ago, and left them with a supervisor who promised to archive them. I continued my route, winter storms, snow, and all, carrying the weight of knowing that some knowledge of the future can be dangerous, but also that human awareness and action can bend even the most detailed predictions. December passed, quiet and bitter, and I came to understand that the letters were never about punishment. They were about observation, and the terrifying responsibility of seeing what might come and choosing how to live anyway. The cold hit me first, sharp and immediate, a wind that cut across the frozen lake and made the skin around my eyes sting. December mornings on this stretch of water were always bitter, the kind of cold that feels like it seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I had been out here before a handful of times, but this year it felt different. The lake was wider, the air heavier, and the light weaker, barely making it past the dull gray of the sky. I had driven out before sunrise, my truck crunching over snow-packed roads, and now I stood on the ice, boots heavy and feet sinking slightly with every step onto the frozen expanse. My breath rose in thick clouds and dissolved into the pale sky. The first few hours were routine. I drilled the hole, careful to avoid the thin, glassy patches that reflected the low sun. The ice smelled faintly metallic and damp, the way ice always did when the water beneath had been trapped and compressed for weeks. I set my lines, small jigs bouncing gently in the half-frozen water, and settled onto my folding stool. The wind had dropped slightly, leaving the lake quiet except for the occasional scrape of ice shifting somewhere far off. I could see my breath, the rhythm of it calming, almost hypnotic, as I stared at the hole. The surface shimmered with a thin sheen of frost that sparkled dimly under the weak daylight, and I could see small bubbles trapped just beneath, frozen in place. It started subtly, a tiny tap against the underside of the ice, a sound so faint I almost thought it was my imagination. I paused mid-breath, listening, and sure enough, it came again, a soft, deliberate knocking, like someone rapping with a fingernail on glass. I shifted my weight, and the sound moved with me, or at least seemed to. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trapped piece of ice moving with the currents below, or a fish nudging against the frozen rim of my hole. But it didn't feel right. My eyes scanned the ice, the endless expanse of pale gray and white, and I realized I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, subtle and dark. They weren't fish. They were too large, too slow, shifting in a way that didn't make sense. I blinked and leaned closer, trying to convince myself it was just shadows, bubbles, or debris frozen in place. The afternoon dragged on. The tapping persisted, slow and irregular, growing more insistent with every hour. I moved along the edge of my hole, and the shapes shifted, following me, sliding under the ice like thick ink spreading in water. My gut twisted. I had read warnings about weak ice, about ice that could give way when you least expected it, but I had never felt that kind of uncertainty in such an immediate, personal way. The lake had always been predictable, solid underfoot. Now, every tap, every shadow beneath the surface made me feel like the ice wasn't just a floor. It was a ceiling holding something that wanted space, that was waiting. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to a dull purple, and the weak December light faded quickly. Shadows pooled across the surface of the ice, and I realized I could barely make out my hole without crouching close. The tapping had become louder, a steady rhythm now, closer to the surface, as if whatever was beneath was testing the ice. I started walking slowly in circles around my spot, trying to spread my weight, watching as cracks began to appear near my feet. Thin, branching lines stretched across the ice, delicate as glass, and then jagged and chaotic as the tension built. Each step made a faint cracking sound, a brittle echo that joined the tapping from below. My heart pounded, a drum in my chest that I couldn't slow. I had no phone signal, and even if I did, no one would hear me out here. The nearest cabin was miles away, buried in the snowy woods that lined the lake, and I knew I had to make my own way off the ice. I kept moving, slow and deliberate, trying to reach the shore without putting too much weight on any one spot. The shapes below had become clearer now, dark forms drifting under the ice like long shadows of logs, but moving in ways that didn't match any debris I'd ever seen. My mind kept circling back to the cold, the isolation, and the strange tapping that refused to stop. It was impossible to ignore. Night fell fully, and with it, a new kind of darkness. The weak December light vanished completely, leaving only the dim reflection of the moon through heavy clouds. My headlamp cut a cone of brightness over the ice, but it did little to pierce the surrounding gloom. The tapping was relentless now, echoing through the ice beneath me, faster and sharper, almost impatient. I froze, afraid that any sudden movement would be enough to break the fragile surface beneath my boots. I could see the cracks spreading like a web, intricate and dangerous, and I realized the ice might not hold me much longer. Panic set in, but it was methodical, practical panic, the kind that makes your muscles tight and your thoughts sharp. I scanned the lake for a safe route, keeping as much weight distributed as possible. Every step made the ice moan and groan. The shadows beneath shifted with me, keeping pace, moving just enough to remind me that whatever was down there was aware of me. I tried to stay calm, placing one boot in front of the other, listening to the taps, feeling the vibrations through the thin, brittle ice. I could hear my own breath now, fast and ragged, and it felt loud in the silent, frozen night. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, I reached a stretch that seemed more solid. The cracks had thinned here, and the ice was thicker, layered with frost and old snow. I moved carefully, testing each step with a tentative weight shift, until I was finally close enough to the tree line to leave the lake entirely. My legs trembled, not just from cold, but from the relief of having made it, from the adrenaline that had kept me moving despite the fear. I reached the edge, boots crunching on snow-covered ground, and allowed myself to collapse against the trunk of a pine, heart still hammering, ears still ringing with the memory of the tapping. The lake behind me was quiet again, deceptively so, the surface smooth and gray in the moonlight. I knew it would look peaceful in the morning, just a frozen expanse, untouched and solid, hiding nothing beneath the ice. But I also knew what I had seen, the dark shifting forms, the irregular taps, and the fragile ice that had almost betrayed me. I stayed there for a long time, shivering in the December cold, letting the fear ebb slowly, reminding myself that I had made it off the lake, intact, alive. I walked back to my truck through the snow, boots leaving heavy prints, feeling the weight of every step, every cautious movement that had saved me. By the time I climbed inside and started the engine, the shaking in my hands had lessened, replaced with a deep exhaustion and a strange, lingering awe at how quickly the familiar could turn dangerous. I drove home slowly, headlights cutting through the early night fog, thinking about the ice, the tapping, and the way the shadows had followed me. I didn't go back that winter, and I didn't forget. The lake remained frozen and silent until spring, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The cold, the darkness, the fragile ice, and the sense of something beneath waiting, patient and aware. I had made it off, and that was enough. The lake had claimed no one else that night, and I carried that simple fact with me, a quiet relief tempered by respect for the raw, indifferent power of the winter wilderness. I arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon, the sky heavy with December clouds that pressed low over the frozen landscape. The drive had been long, the road narrow and unplowed, winding through dense stands of spruce and pine weighed down by snow. Each mile seemed to take me farther from civilization, farther from any noise or interruption, which was exactly why I had chosen this place. The cabin itself was small, made of rough-hewn logs darkened with age, with a steep roof that had collected snow in thick, heavy drifts. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, though I suspected the wood stove had not been lit recently. I carried my bags inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and set about arranging the space. A single room held a kitchenette, a small table, and a bed tucked into the corner beneath a window that looked out onto the surrounding forest. I set my laptop on the table and stacked my notebooks nearby. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, and the quiet was almost tangible, pressing against my ears. By late afternoon, I had unpacked everything I needed and settled into the routine I had imagined for this retreat. I made myself a simple dinner, then returned to the table with my laptop and notes, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, a low sighing that set the cabin to shivering softly. Hours passed, and I wrote steadily, the words coming slowly but steadily, until the room felt both cozy and claustrophobic. The snow outside darkened under the low light of the waning day, and I shut the curtains, sealing myself in the warm glow of the lamp. I tried not to notice the growing silence beyond the walls, telling myself it was the natural hush of a winter evening in isolation. Night came fully, deep and cold, the kind of darkness that seems to press into the spaces around you. I had just closed my laptop and was preparing for bed when I heard it, a faint crunching, slow and deliberate, outside the cabin. I froze, listening. It sounded like footsteps moving along the perimeter of the building, dragging slightly through the snow. I told myself it was an animal, a deer perhaps, or a rabbit, though the sound was too deliberate, too measured for that. Then came the tapping, light but steady, against the wall near the window. My pulse spiked, and I checked the locks on the door, fumbling with the deadbolt even though I was certain I had locked it earlier. I moved the bolt again, testing it until it felt immovable, then retreated to the bed, my body tense under the covers. The tapping continued, irregular now, punctuated by the crunching outside, circling the cabin, moving in patterns that I could not predict. I lay awake, listening to the snow shift and crack beneath unknown weight, and with every noise my mind began to race through the possibilities. I convinced myself it was someone wandering in the forest, lost, perhaps a local checking on the cabin, though I had made it clear I would be alone. The rational explanation offered little comfort. I could hear every footstep, every scrape of boot against ice, magnified in the silence. Morning arrived gray and brittle, the sky overcast and low. I dressed quickly, layering wool and fleece, and stepped outside. The snow was thick and dry underfoot, each step producing a crisp crackle. I scanned the perimeter of the cabin and immediately saw the footprints. They led up to the porch, stopping abruptly at the edge of the steps. There was no trail beyond, as if whoever had walked here had vanished into the snow itself. The pattern of the prints suggested a single person, moving deliberately, pausing at the porch, then leaving no trace. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach, a weight that settled over my chest. I returned inside, the cabin feeling smaller now, every corner and shadow more pronounced, every sound amplified. I tried to carry on with my writing, but the quiet had changed. Each creak of the cabin, each sigh of the wind felt like it could be someone moving just out of sight. I kept checking the door, the windows, even the small chimney flap that opened above the stove, convinced that something had shifted while I slept. I paced the room, touching surfaces to make sure nothing had moved, telling myself I was overreacting, that the snow outside could hide anyone who might have wandered near the cabin. It was late morning when I found it. A photograph slipped under the edge of the table near my chair. I picked it up, my hands trembling despite myself. The image was unmistakable. It showed me sleeping, curled under the covers, the faint light of the lamp casting shadows across my face. The angle was impossible to have achieved from within the room without being seen, and the thought of someone having been inside, watching me while I slept, made my stomach turn. I checked the locks again, ran through the small cabin, inspected the windows, every door, the chimney, and the back wall, but found no sign of forced entry. It was as though someone had appeared and disappeared without leaving a mark. The rest of the day passed in a tense blur. I kept the doors locked, the blinds drawn, and moved cautiously from one part of the cabin to another. I could not focus on writing, not with the image of that photograph burned into my mind. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every sound from the outside amplified in my awareness. I walked the room in circles, thinking through every possibility, from a hidden observer in the forest to someone with knowledge of the cabin's location. Each explanation seemed insufficient, leaving gaps that my imagination could only fill with growing dread. By nightfall, I had decided to leave, though the roads were treacherous with fresh snow and ice. I packed my essentials, double-checked my locks, and stepped out into the pale light of dusk. The snow reflected the dim sky, softening the edges of the world, and I realized I could not see any footprints leading away from the cabin beyond my own. I traced the porch steps with my gloved hands, noting again how the prints simply stopped at the edge, as if the person had vanished in the act of walking. The cold air bit at my face, and I shivered, not entirely from the temperature. I started down the narrow path I had driven in on, leaving my laptop and notebooks behind, my mind focused only on reaching a place where I felt safe again. It took hours to reach the main road, and by then the winter sky had darkened completely. I drove slowly, constantly scanning the sides of the road, expecting at any moment to see movement, to feel the presence I had sensed in the cabin. Each bend in the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in on either side, but eventually I reached a small town, its lights glowing warmly against the snow. I stopped at a gas station, hands shaking, and explained nothing to anyone, simply asking for directions and relief in the mundane act of refueling. Later, I learned that the cabin had been on private property, rarely visited in winter, and that trespassers were unusual but not impossible. I never returned, and I never discovered who had entered the cabin or taken that photograph. The memory of the footprints at the porch, the snow undisturbed beyond them, and the photo left behind became an indelible mark. I tell myself it was someone reckless, perhaps curious, perhaps even criminal, but grounded in reality, not fantasy. The isolation I had sought for writing had revealed, instead of vulnerability, I had not anticipated. I never stayed in a remote cabin alone in December again, and I never wrote a single line there, leaving the words I had intended to capture trapped in the empty, snowbound space where I had almost been watched. I started my December route just as the sun was slipping behind the distant hills, the sky a flat gray that promised snow by night. The roads were quieter than usual, and the cold was sharp enough to sting exposed skin, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I drove my small delivery van along the winding rural lanes, passing houses spaced far apart, their yards half hidden by frost-coated hedges and leafless trees. Normally at this time of year, even in these remote spots, there would be signs of life. Lights on in windows, smoke curling from chimneys, dogs barking from fenced yards. That evening there was nothing. I noticed it first at the second house. The porch light was off. The windows were dark, and the yard looked abandoned. I stepped out of the van, boots crunching on gravel stiff with frost, and checked the mailbox. It was empty. I glanced around and realized there wasn't a single sound. No wind rattling branches, no distant car engine, no faint hum of someone wrapping presents inside. Even the dogs, normally alert to any stranger on the road, were absent or silent. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, the quiet pressing in like a weight against my chest. I kept moving, dropping off packages as I went. At each house, I followed the same routine. Park, pull the package from the van, walk up to the porch, ring the bell, wait. No one answered. I left the packages in plain view when there was a covered porch, or on the steps if not, taking care to make them look presentable. At first, I assumed everyone was inside with the heat on, watching TV or cooking, just ignoring the doorbell. But the further down the road I went, the stranger it felt. The houses were dark, and the stillness stretched between them like a tangible thing. Even the smell of wood smoke, which usually marked someone tending a fire, was absent. By the time I reached the last house on the lane, a small, two-story place set back from the road, I was uneasy. The snow was starting to fall lightly, a thin layer dusting the driveway, and the dusk had turned the surroundings into a blur of gray and white. I could barely make out the shape of the house until I was close enough to see that the door was unlocked. That made my stomach tighten. I never left a door unlocked when I dropped a package. I checked the handle carefully. It moved freely. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Pine, cinnamon, something baked, a normal Christmas smell that made me pause. The living room was lit by a single lamp in the corner, weak but enough to show the scene. The tree was in the corner, ornaments dusted with frost from the chilly room, presents scattered beneath it. But none of the packages were mine. Every box was torn open, ribbons pulled apart, tissue paper torn, nothing neatly wrapped. It was clear someone had been here for a while, rifling through everything, yet there was no other sign of life. The house was empty, quiet except for the hum of the heating system struggling against the winter cold. I froze in the doorway, scanning the room, my mind racing to explain it. Maybe the residents had returned and unwrapped their gifts early. That seemed plausible until I noticed the oddities. Nothing was exactly where it should be. Chairs were pushed over slightly, a rug was bunched in the corner, the edge of the tree skirt was folded up like someone had tripped on it. Small details, but they added a weight to the scene, a feeling that it wasn't just a casual unwrapping. I turned to leave, thinking it best not to linger. My boots crunched over the floorboards, the sound echoing slightly in the empty house. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffle behind me, almost imperceptible, like someone stepping lightly on the carpet. I froze. My heart began to pound. I convinced myself it was the house settling, the heat moving through the ducts, my imagination. Still, I took careful steps toward the door, the unease crawling up my spine. The sound followed. I could hear it faintly, rhythmically, each step a little after mine, keeping pace, but never catching up. I moved faster, my hand on the door handle. Another shuffle, closer now, just enough to make me spin around. The room was still empty. I scanned every corner, the staircase leading upstairs, the kitchen doorway to the side, but there was nothing. My pulse was hammering, and the heat of fear made my breath come out in sharp, visible bursts. I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me, and the sound stopped immediately. I pressed my back against the cold door, trying to calm myself, listening. Nothing. Only the light snow hitting the ground and the faint creak of the van in the driveway. I climbed back into the van, locking the doors as if that alone could protect me. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dark house through the windshield. My hands were shaking, and I realized I was holding my breath. Slowly, I started the engine, the hum filling the van as the heat kicked in. I pulled onto the road, the tires crunching over the frozen gravel, and didn't look back until I was several hundred yards down the lane. The house remained there, silent and still, as though it had never been entered at all. On the drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow along the road, every darkened window, made my heart jump. I reasoned it in my head. Maybe someone had been in the house earlier, checking the neighborhood, rifling through gifts, but had left quickly when they heard me coming. The unlocked door could have been carelessness, or perhaps a way to make me pause, to see me, to know I was there. There was no supernatural element, no unexplainable presence, just human observation, human mischief, maybe even something worse. By the time I reached the main road, the snow had thickened, and the lights from nearby houses created blurred halos in the white. I shook my head, trying to dispel the memory of the sound following me. My route was done for the day, and the rest of the deliveries were scheduled for the next morning. I parked the van at the depot, stepping into the warmth and light, feeling relief seep into my bones. My manager glanced at me, asked if everything went okay. I nodded, not mentioning the last house. I didn't have proof of anything abnormal. It would have sounded ridiculous. But in the quiet of my own apartment that night, I thought of the house, of the open presence, of the sound that had mirrored my own steps, and I realized how carefully human observation can be masked as emptiness. The next morning, I returned to the area, intent on checking the house again. The driveway was clear now, freshly shoveled. The door was locked. The presents were untouched. I left my packages on the porch, took pictures with my phone just in case, and noted the details in my delivery log. Later, a neighbor mentioned that the previous week a pair of thieves had been caught stealing from houses in that very lane. It clicked then, the unlocked door, the rifled gifts, the feeling of being followed. It had been deliberate, methodical, human. No ghosts, no unexplained phenomena. Just the quiet manipulation of fear by someone who had known I would come that night. I still think about it when I drive down empty rural roads during December. The cold, the quiet, the absence of life. It all magnifies the sense that someone could be watching, moving just out of sight, leaving subtle signs that make your mind race. That night, I learned to trust the ordinary signs of human presence more than anything else, and I've never ignored the weight of silence since. The last house on that road taught me that horror doesn't have to be supernatural. It can be the calculated, patient watching of another human being, and sometimes that is enough to make your blood run cold.